This is God Rock. Welcome to God Rock, your weekly dose of music and motivation.
No stairway. Denied.
Crank it up. Shake the heavens.
You get to stand there and read at Sodom and Gomorrah. I had to do all the work.
What work did you do? You lit a few fires.
I rained down sulfur, man. There's a subtle difference.
You're listening to God Rock. You're listening to God Rock.
So let's jump just headfirst into this morning's topic, the separation of church and state. You know, I wasn't sure about this one when I thought it up a couple of weeks ago. And what started me on this was the idea of a pastor running for political office. It was a discussion I got into a few weeks ago, and I didn't know exactly where I stood on it, partly because I feel that politics corrupts. And to me, a pastor should be the moral compass for his flock. And that worries me because it seems that even people who get into politics with the best of intentions don't always come out squeaky clean on the other side. But I wasn't exactly sure I wanted to go with this subject. So, you know, it took some reflection. And this week, I almost thought about changing it. I almost thought about chickening out. But then something happened. And maybe you've heard of it by now. Maybe you've seen the video by now. A bunch of yahoos came into our area this last Wednesday, hooting and hollering and making a spectacle of themselves, yelling obscenities, putting down the local police, and hiding like the cowards they are behind what they call their First Amendment rights. As a person, I could care less about these people. I think they're morons, and I know that doesn't sound very Christian of me, but as I've stated here before, I'm a Christian, not a sucker. Their stupidity I could care less about. What they've got to say, I block it out. But one move they pulled on their quote-unquote video really got my attention. Now, if you haven't seen it, here's kind of the scenario. They were in the Texas County Courthouse acting the fool, and one of them notices a cross on the wall of an office up there. He starts blowing and going about how that shouldn't be there, and he's going to contact the ACLU over it, and he's going to demand that it's taken down. And that really sealed it for me. I thought to myself, what gives you the right? Is the First Amendment truly about freedom of speech and the separation of church and state? And it made it clear that I really wanted to kind of discuss that subject this morning. So we're going to go for it. The so-called wall of separation of church and state has done more damage to America's religious and moral tradition than any other utterance of the Supreme Court. Now, while the First Amendment was originally intended to prevent the establishment of a national religion and thus ensure religious liberty and freedom, the Supreme Court's misuse of the term separation of church and state has fostered hostility toward rather than the protection of religious freedom. Phrase has been used by the court to outlaw 10 Commandment displays in public buildings, prayer and Bible reading in schools, clergy and even student invocations at school events, and other public acknowledgments of gods. Such decisions clearly negate what the Founding Fathers' premise of America's Christian identity should have been. But where does it all start? That's the question. Does it start with the First Amendment? Now, believe it or not, the phrase wall of separation between church and state was never even used by the authors of the First Amendment. Instead, the term was used in 1802 by Thomas Jefferson when he argued in a private letter that the federal government should not, under the First Amendment, encroach upon religious freedom. The Founding Fathers wrote the First Amendment to prohibit the establishment of a national religion or denomination. Nothing more. Not to prohibit public religious expression. Wow. The government getting it wrong. I'm shocked. I'm sure you are too. But what if I told you I agree to a point on separation of church and state? Now, you may be saying to yourself, wait, what? Before you throw me to the wolves, hear me out on this. The question I ask you is, do you trust your government 100%? And I know there's a lot of you out there shaking your head no. Now, we live in a constitutional republic rather than a theocracy, and for good reason. State-sanctioned churches would become puppets of the government. Under such circumstances, the edicts of fallible man would take precedence over inspired teachings of Scripture. And when the state heads the church, the integrity of the gospel is far too easily compromised. Just remember that money is the root of all evil. Think about it this way. What if your pastor was a government-paid employee, like a congressman, like a senator, being swayed by others in power, being told what to tell you about, special interest groups coming and saying, hey, here's some money, why don't you talk about this? Why don't you push this agenda? Things like that. To me, civil servants living on tax dollars would be unfit to serve as a pastor because their loyalties would absolutely be divided between the one who calls on them and the one who pays them. Such compromises cannot and will not belong in the pulpit. They can't be there. Let the government build the roads. Let Christ build his church. However, though, there is a twist to that statement. While I don't think that the government should serve in the role of a pastor, I think it would be nonsense to say that men and women of faith have no business in politics. When you look through history, it's hardly a secret that people like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln were men of deep, unwavering Christian faith. Their personal writings, their public statements, their church involvement, and the testimony of their families reveal lifelong, in fact, commitments to Christianity. There were not just a couple. In fact, pretty much most of the founding fathers, the majority of the nation's founders, aligned themselves with Christianity in one form or another. What the separation of church from state has done today, it set us up for one of the oldest dangers recorded in the Bible. Men setting themselves up as God. The moral framework of our universe guarantees terrible consequences for the country that grants sovereignty to something other than God, because in such circumstances, sovereignty ultimately becomes the property of the state. What it comes down to nowadays is that America's got to choose. Either we ignore the intentions of our founding fathers and grant sovereignty to the state, which clears the way for people like Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin to reign, or we bow humbly before the one true God and obey God's principles for justice. True freedom is only going to be able to exist in our land governed according to the principles that we set forth in Romans 13, verses 3 and 4. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you, for he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. America does not want a church state. England has a church state. America does not want one denomination considered the nation's church. But, on the other hand, America does have a religious heritage. America, while not desire a state church, does desire religion in their lives. And that includes religious expression in everyday exchange. What these clown shoes who came to Guyman want, like many of their ilk, is a redefining of the phrase separation of church and state. And they wanted to exclude Christian religious expression in America. They want not only separation of church and state defined on their terms, but they want the exclusion of the Christian religion and anything coming close to that particular religious expression, period, which is why they were so worked up about seeing a cross on a wall in a state office. The problem is, though, they'll even tolerate other religions, as you'll see in the news presently doing with the Muslim infiltration. But it's Christian and Christianity that they want cleansed from America. In other words, it's a religious cleansing they desire for this nation, the extinguishing specifically of the Christian faith. What those of the Christian heritage have got to do, and far more matter-of-factly today than we've ever done in the past, is what we've got to do is we've got to make it clear to the public what separation of church and state really means. It's got to be preached from the pulpit. It's got to be taught in Sunday school classes. It's got to be shouted from the rooftops, in fact. We cannot apologize for being Christian. And if we do, if we sit there and apologize, if we sit there and be in silence, we allow the enemy to win out.
God Rock is a presentation of Two Legit Productions and KKBS Radio, heard weekly on this station. God Rock is copyright MLS Communications. Questions, comments, concerns? Email us, godrock@kkbs.com.
You've got prayers.